Hello and welcome. Today we're here to talk about one of my favorite books ever, Dune. Spoilers if you haven't read it, even to some of the sequels. In this video, I am looking at the heavy influence of Egyptian mythology on the series, and the how and why of including it. First off, we have to recognize that as people with access to the internet, we have a certain amount of privilege. Until a lot more recently, it was very common practice in Western education to cover the myths, stories, and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. It was significantly less common to have a working knowledge of Norse mythology, although fantasy authors have really pushed society in the direction of a greater understanding of it in the last century. But much less common than either was the study of Egyptian mythology. There was a bit of a mania in the UK and even the US around Egyptian culture when they started excavating tombs. But despite that, Egyptian mythology never had the cultural importance in the West that Greek or Roman mythology did. Part of this is a lack of understanding. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, it was deciphered in 1822, and only then did scholars start to make real headway understanding Egyptian culture. By that time, Greek and Roman culture and mythology had been required reading for thousands of years. With that in mind, let's recognize what Herbert intended Dune to be, and I don't mean as the main inspiration for Star Wars. Frank Herbert intended Dune to be an inversion and criticism of the hero's journey, but in order to invert or criticize it, he had to understand it intimately. Frank Herbert read Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and though he recognized Campbell had correctly identified a certain number of story elements across various mythologies, he did not like it. The basic message of Dune is to beware heroes and messiahs. Herbert has said this in as many words. He accomplishes this by having the main protagonist, Paul, cynically use the Fremen based on a vision of the future necessary for him to both survive and achieve his personal ends. While the climax sees him ostensibly avenge himself on the vile House Harkonnen, take leadership away from the ruthless Emperor, and essentially accomplish the hero's journey, Herbert has framed this as a uniformly negative thing. Becoming emperor while being the spiritual leader of the Fremen has caused a holy war to wash over the galaxy, bringing mass death and destabilization. Instead of the power of the galaxy balanced as a tripod of the great houses, the Emperor and the Spacing Guild, along with other more ancillary powers, it is now concentrated with Paul himself. Paul continues to see the future and acknowledges that it is in his power to steer humanity toward a better future, what he calls the golden path, but he is unwilling to do so. From the outside, Paul is a classic hero's journey manifested, but upon closer inspection, he has used outrageous power for selfish ends and has failed to do good in the end. In later books, the narrative focus switches to Paul's son, who does make the ultimate sacrifice in order to steer humanity toward a brighter future. The idea being that a super being with ultimate power and the intelligence and clarity to see what humanity needs would have to assume complete authoritarian power to essentially trick humanity into not destroying itself over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. This attitude is basically the same tone as Grimdark, and it represents an extremely negative view of humanity as a whole and dismisses the idea of heroism as unrealistic and ineffectual. Not only that, but it is essentially an endorsement of fascism. Leto II is basically the Übermensch, a brutal authoritarian dictator complete with robust propaganda, spying on his own citizens, treating humanity like serfs, and only through tricking humanity and fostering ignorance is he able to save it. Now, I'm not here to debate the merits of this worldview, but what I will say is that this attitude did not make him many friends among other very prolific authors. J.R.R. Tolkien and George R.R. Martin, to give two examples, are very notably not fans of Frank Herbert's work. Tolkien's work has major themes of the struggle to overcome evil, however it manifests. Martin's work contains a brutal world that is sometimes bleak and can seem hopeless, but he is careful to show heroes who genuinely try to make things better through selflessness. Whether their objections to his work were because of these significant differences or not is a debate that does not have enough evidence. What I can say is that they could hardly criticize the skill with which he writes, the method he has used to pull his world together, and the extreme care he has used to build a vivid world that both feels real, yet still has great mystery about it. Dune is an absolute masterpiece, but it's also a huge departure from typical fantasy and sci-fi. Joseph Campbell, author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, codified the hero's journey as a story that is, in broad strokes, common to basically every culture on Earth. Through the mythologies we tell, we see it over and over again. Part of the reason fantasy literature has a weight and resonates so well is that it is built on this hero's journey, and by extension, our common mythological roots. Not only that, but it has become a habit throughout most fantasy literature to include subtle references and parallels to characters and mythologies as an archetypal basis. Frank Herbert has named his protagonist family after the sons of Atreus from Homer's Iliad, sometimes collectively referred to as the Atreides. He also uses parts of various Greek stories like Jason and the Argonauts, Theseus and the Minotaur, the Odyssey, and many others in his story. For more on his Greek influences, see my Patreon video, Dune, Beware Greeks Bearing Myths. This video, however, is not about his subtle parallels to Greek mythologies in his world building. It is about the main plot and its very direct basis in Egyptian mythology. Let's look at how Frank Herbert created this bleak, dystopian, futuristic fantasy. First, we look for symbolism in anything that the characters wear. The House Atreides sigil is a red hawk, a bird of prey quite similar to the falcon, which is hugely important in Egyptian mythology. The falcon used to be classified as a hawk, and is still sometimes incorrectly categorized so. This is to parallel the falcon-headed gods of Egyptian mythology, Ra and Horus, both at different times kings of the gods. This is the point of this video. Paul Atreides is mirroring the story of Horus the Avenger. Even more deftly done when you recognize that the Emperor Shaddam is representing Ra, and is often noted to be related to Leto Atreides. Because the story is so intrinsic to Dune, I'll summarize it. Ra was the original king of the Egyptian gods. As he was getting older, he was forced to give up his throne to Osiris, who is usually portrayed as a human in contrast to most Egyptian gods. But when he is given an animal head, it is a hawk. Osiris is betrayed and murdered by his usurping brother Set, so that Set could take the throne. Set hacked him into pieces that he dispersed all over Egypt. He wanted no competition for his throne, so he tried to kill Osiris's son, Horus. He gouged out Horus's eye as Horus escaped with his mother, Isis. Set could not pursue, as he was a jackal-headed god and could not fly. So as the god of desert storms, he sent a great sandstorm after them to destroy them. But Horus and Isis were able to fly in its eye and escape. For years, Set looked for Horus to try and kill him. But Horus stayed on the run, while Isis found the pieces of Osiris. She puts him back together, and since he is a god but dead, he becomes the god of the underworld. Eventually, Horus becomes full-grown and starts creating alliances with the Egyptian gods against Set. He even has Khonshu, the god of the moon, spin him a magic blue eye out of moonlight. This eye allows him to see into the spirit world, or underworld of Egyptian mythology, called the Duat. Now being possessed of depth perception, Horus returns to avenge himself on Set, defeats him, and claims the throne of the gods. He allows Set to live, but forces an oath of loyalty from him as king. We can trace this story throughout the entirety of Dune. Paul and Leto are both associated with hawks through their sigil, and are even described as having hawkish noses and faces. This is to relate them to Osiris and Horus. Leto is betrayed and murdered like Osiris. You can even look forward to the Fremen worshipping at the shrine of his skull to mark him as a god of death and the underworld, like Osiris. Paul ends up escaping with his mother, who is referred to constantly as a Bene Gesserit witch and who is pregnant. This is to mark her as the parallel to Isis, goddess of fertility and magic. They escape the Harkonnens by flying through the eye of a storm, just like Horus and Isis did. Paul then spends years with the Fremen, growing into a man and eventually leading them. Just before his war with the Harkonnens, Paul starts to lament his lack of vision of the future, a parallel to Horus not wanting to take on Set without two functioning eyes. Paul then drinks the water of life, which allows him to see perfectly and turns his eyes blue, much like the blue eye of moonlight Horus received. He even learned that Baron Harkonnen was his grandfather, related to him in much the same way that Horus is related to Set. Paul avenges himself on the Harkonnens, with Alia killing the Baron and Paul killing Feyd-Rautha. Then Paul takes the throne and crown from Emperor Shaddam. This is like Horus taking the throne and crown that were once Ra's. And this is underscored by the fact that Shaddam's House Corrino's sigil is a lion. Ra himself is a falcon-headed god like Horus, which works well with the fact that Leto Atreides is directly related to the Emperor Shaddam. There is a separate concept, however, called the Eye of Ra, which is a lion goddess named Sekhmet. She is a sort of embodiment of the sun's wrath and a symbol of the sun god's authority. Sekhmet, however, has a split personality and can be pacified by morphing into her other half, Hathor. We could wax poetic about the duality of a destruction and creation goddess, but the key here is that Horus marries Hathor. Paul behaves similarly, marrying the daughter of Emperor Shaddam, Princess Irulan. Sekhmet, as a golden lion sun goddess, reflects Shaddam well as he sits on the golden lion throne with a lion sigil. His daughter Irulan, as the sort of Hathor aspect of Sekhmet, gives Paul ruling legitimacy in much the same way Horus marrying Hathor gained legitimacy. The Egyptian pantheon, like most godly pantheons, contains a certain amount of incestuous relationships. With various characters and houses representing gods in the Egyptian pantheon, Herbert had to find a way to create that interconnected relationship. Duke Leto is largely representing Osiris, who is betrayed and killed by his brother Set. House Harkonnen is playing the role of Set, but they're not related. Despite this, the Baron refers to Leto as cousin, just to call out that familial relationship. This isn't even out of the ordinary. In real-world medieval settings, it was a common practice of nobles to refer to each other as cousin. This was to denote themselves as family of the same social class, and also sometimes on the assumption that they were often literally related, as the arranged marriages of aristocracy were also somewhat incestuous. This is compounded later for Paul as he confronts the Harkonnens with the knowledge that he is directly related, calling Feyd-Rautha cousin, even though Feyd is the Baron's nephew and Paul is his grandson. The duel between Paul and Feyd-Rautha also mimics Egyptian mythology in other ways, not least of which is sexual. Now, I left out a fairly significant part of Horus's defeat of Set. In some iterations, Horus the Avenger's victory is shown as the culmination of a long conflict where he finally overcomes his evil uncle. In others, they wrestle, and Set dominates Horus. Egyptian mythology, like many mythologies, has crude allusions to sexuality, both overt and subtextual. And I emphasize crude here, so Please stay with me because I promise I am as uncomfortable with some of this as you are. There is a whole contest about Set and Horus's seed, where it ends up, and how that qualifies them to be pharaoh. I'm not going to say anything more about it. What I will mention is that the ancient Egyptians believed that the male seed was poisonous. It was necessary poison, but poisonous nonetheless, and responsible for things like morning sickness and the general distress of pregnancy. Now, this was weird, gross, and problematic, but I told you for a reason. And that reason is that Frank Herbert included it in the duel between Paul and Feyd-Rautha, among other places. At one point during the duel, Feyd pins Paul to the floor. He then has a poisoned needle poke out from his waist in an attempt to sneakily stab Paul and decide the duel. A poisoned needle from the waist being thrust into Paul is an imitation of Set's sexual domination of Horus, complete with phallus and a reference to the Egyptian idea that the male seed was poison. This isn't even the only representation of this concept. Jessica drinks the water of life, which is a poison, and it forces her to give birth, associating the poison with birth as it was the seed itself. Paul drinks the same water of life, which is taboo and lethal for men, again mimicking Egyptian cultural beliefs. Paul changing the poison and surviving it works well with Horus as the Egyptian god of medicine, from which the pharmaceutical RX symbol is derived. I'm definitely not the first to point out that harvesting the water of life from the phallic baby worms who die after vomiting is representing exactly what you think it's representing. I have to make something clear before we move any further, and that is that I have committed a cardinal sin of recounting Egyptian mythology. The Empire of Egypt lasted thousands of years and covered a huge amount of territory. Gods were imported, exported, syncretized, conflated, confused, and the stories surrounding them just changed, as they do over time. I gave you one version of Horus's origin story, but other prominent versions exist as well, and Herbert definitely plays with them. We looked at a version where Horus and Isis escape Set through a sandstorm. Another version has Horus not even being born yet. In this version, Isis has to gather up all of the pieces of Osiris that Set cut him into. She finds everything but his wood. With Osiris being a fertility god, this is pretty problematic. So they make him wood, out of euphemism. I mean wood. Osiris Frankenstein is then treated as an undead god, becomes ruler of the underworld, and impregnates Isis. Somehow. Herbert's version of pregnancy from a dead husband plays out with Alia, Paul's sister, who Jessica is carrying after Leto's death. The final thing I want to look at, vis-a-vis Egyptian mythology in the Dune series, is the relationship with water. Water on Arrakis is quite precious for obvious reasons. It is harvested, protected, and stored underground. This makes a lot of sense narratively for a desert civilization, but it's also intentionally placing water in an underworld location. This is a great representation of the Egyptian conception of the afterlife, an underworld realm called the Duat, which was a river. The Duat was a spirit world, which was more of a nightly journey than a specific location. A lot of esoteric concepts are at play here, but the basic idea is that every night the sun god Ra, along with the other gods like Set and Osiris, traveled through the river of the Duat on a bark or reed boat of the sun. They fought the serpent of chaos, Apophis, defeating it, and showing the triumph of order over chaos every night. This victory brings the new day. The Fremen keeping large stores of water underground, largely filled out by water harvested from their dead, makes a great symbolic equivalent to an underworld river of souls, which is how the Duat is represented. The Duat, being under the sands, works well when we recognize that the sandworms are most definitely playing the role of Apophis and are revered as the god Shai-Hulud. Now, this brings us to a very interesting philosophy in Egyptian mythology on the nature of villains. We've seen Set as an unequivocal villain, but in the context of the nightly cycle, Set is portrayed as an important servant of Ra and necessary for the nightly defeat of Apophis. Apophis is a manifestation of chaos and an enemy of order. Set, in some ways, is not actually so different from Apophis. He is a god of storms, deserts, violence, and chaos. This makes a lot of sense from the point of view of Egyptian culture. Apophis is the primal embodiment of chaos, a disastrous primordial leviathan who will one day swallow up all of creation. Set, however, is a different sort of representation of chaos. Set is the chaos of nature and man. He is a god of storms and the chaos they embody, but they are both intrinsic to nature and necessary. He is a god of violence, but Set's chaos is a necessary structural chaos inherent in nature and humanity. Apophis is the chaos that opposes and eventually ends creation. Both of these are represented in Dune. The sandworms, somewhere between Set and Apophis, bring the storms of the desert with them, causing them in a symbolic sense. From a less literal standpoint, the Harkonnens represent Set. Vladimir Harkonnen destroys the Osiris figure, tries to have the Horus and Isis figures, Paul and Jessica, killed, and fails. We also get point-of-view chapters with the Baron plotting to become emperor, which was Set's main goal. So if we're contextualizing them with ancient Egypt, the Harkonnens are a very good Set figure. They are order within chaos. They have chaotic, brutal, and violent methods, but they ultimately want to rule and are not opposed to an order where they sit on the throne, very much like Set. The sandworms, however, are more like Apophis. They do have certain things in common, like storms, even if that is blurring narrative with symbolism. But they live in a deep sea of sand, much as Apophis is native to the primordial sea of chaos, which solidified through the stewardship of order into the Duat. This is something we see represented by the domesticated, stunted sandworms. The Fremen literally ride sandworms around this sea or ocean, a poignant metaphor for harnessing the power of chaos. Interestingly, using the worms as transportation is sort of what the galaxy at large is doing, by harvesting the worm's spice for the guild navigators. We can trace regular parallels and references to things like the Canterbury Tales, Paul the Apostle, Babylon, Sumer, Roman history, and more modern Middle Eastern politics. But that's all that they are. References, parallels, world building. The use of Egyptian mythology is load-bearing, it's structural. The plot of Dune is based on the Egyptian story with the most staying power, and it slots readily into the hero's journey. It's a brilliant way to level criticism at the hero's journey, and just as brilliant a way to pay homage to an amazing, millennia-old story. If you enjoyed this video, you can support my channel by liking, subscribing, even leaving a comment. If you have critiques or complaints, comment also works well for that, and I'm listening. If you want to support my continued work in literary analysis, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, where there is also a companion video to this one on Frank Herbert's use of Greek mythology. Thanks for watching. Thousand Voices, out.